Hi, this is Pastor Josh from First Baptist to Queen. Thank you for joining us on our Wednesday night study of a verse-by-verse walkthrough of the entire Old Testament. Here we are in 1 Samuel chapter 18. We've been looking at the life of David now. He has become, Saul has become greatly fearful of David, as David has now married Saul's daughter, Michal, which is where we pick up here in 1 Samuel chapter 18, verse 28. But when Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with David and that Michal, Saul's daughter, loved him, Saul was even more afraid of David. So Saul was David's enemy. Continually. It was obviously evident, even to a man so deliberately far from the Lord as was Saul, that the Lord was with David, that it could not be denied. Saul witnessed the evidence of the Lord's presence in David's life through his wisdom, his patience, his graciousness, and persistent miraculous successes. David again and again had been sent by Saul against seemingly insurmountable odds in battle, and David returned every time with an overwhelming victory. So now, not only did Saul witness the Lord's hand on him, he knew in his heart that the Lord had left him, Saul, and gone to David. And added to that was now the fact that his son and heir Jonathan had become David's best friend and seemingly sworn loyalty to him and his would-be reign. Then, insult to injury, Saul's plan to use his daughter Michal as a trap into which to snare David, possibly through her idolatry, was backfiring. Not only was David not succumbing to any idolatrous temptations, he was also not falling in battle. And Michal's loyalty had switched from her father to David because of her love for him. Saul's already afflicted soul was being driven even more insane by so many external factors. But the problem was that these factors were set up to destroy Saul, or were not set up to destroy Saul or make him feel as though everything was against him and out to get him. The reality was that Saul had set himself up against everything that the Lord was doing. It is always a dangerous thing to set ourselves up against the Lord, to set ourselves up really against anything that the Lord is doing. We must always double check our motivations and intentions because sin is often subtle and sneaky, which was the case for Saul as he set himself up as the enemy of David for the rest of his life. Look at verse 30. So then the commanders of the Philistines came out to battle, and as often as they came out, David had more success than all the servants of Saul, so that his name was highly esteemed. So again here, the commanders of the Philistines and each of their respective armies marched out for war against the Israelites. This happened over and over and over again without any seeming end in sight. The Philistines should not have even been around anymore to be able to come against Israel. Because when David defeated Goliath, and the Israelites, their army, pursued the Philistines, any future battle should have been snuffed out right then and there. That was part of the deal struck between the nations when the Philistine champion fought against the Israelite champion. The losing side would submit to becoming subjects of the winning side. In addition, the Israelites chased the Philistines right up to the very gates of their own cities, striking them down as they pursued. But the Israelites chose to not finish off the Philistines and to not force them to uphold the covenant made in the battle. Instead of marching into the now unprotected cities to conquer them, the Israelites merely retreated. They went back to plunder the abandoned Philistine military camp rather than conquer the cities and plunder them. They settled for a small, already won plunder rather than a larger, yet to be seized plunder. So Israel would have to keep fighting against the Philistines for many years to come, and this would ultimately be Saul's final undoing, as the Philistines would be the very ones to finish him off. But for now, here in 1 Samuel 18, though the entire nation's enemy, David himself was finding repeated victories against the Philistines. And David not only was victorious each time that he went out to fight against them, but he had more victories than any of the other Israelite soldiers. Notice that the commanders of the Philistines are specified here as coming out against Israel to fight, but David's successes are being compared to other Israelite commanders. David, his victories are described as being far greater than any of all the servants of Saul. So David's victories are being recognized for their own greatness against every one of the fighters in Saul's army. David's victories are not being celebrated simply because of his prowess as a military leader and strategist, but rather David is being singled out because of his victorious fighting abilities in every capacity. In addition to his leadership skills, he is being presented to us as readers as the single greatest military fighter in Israel's history. And as such, everyone everywhere throughout their nation, and undoubtedly throughout the other surrounding nations, has heard of his name and of what he could do on the battlefield. Verse 1 of chapter 19. And Saul spoke to Jonathan his son and to all his servants that they should kill David. But Jonathan, Saul's son, delighted much in David. Thus far, Saul has set himself up as an enemy of David, even if only in his own mind. But now things are going to shift into a widespread conspiracy to eliminate David by any means necessary. You had Jonathan, who loved David. Michal loved David. The army loved David. The nation loved David. Their enemies feared David above all others. This was all too much for Saul under normal circumstances to be able to handle, but with his consistently afflicted mind, he could not bear any of it. So Saul calls in his people. Possibly these are the ones that he assumes would still be loyal to him. If he knew of Michal's affections for David, surely Saul would also know that Jonathan had come to consider David to be like one of his own brothers. But maybe Saul still thought that Jonathan would be more loyal to him as a father than to any outsider like David. But now, Jonathan did love David, but he also loved his father. Jonathan found himself in a difficult position of being loyal to both his father, the current king, and loyal to David, the next anointed king. So Saul here in this verse, he lays all his cards on the table to his hopefully loyal servants and his intended heir, Jonathan. Saul gives them a specific command to seek an opportunity to execute David and take that opportunity without hesitation. He thinks that removing David will relieve his paranoia and thoughts of external threats. But in truth, his paranoia and thoughts of threats stem from his own lack of reliance on the Lord. Because when we take our eyes off of the Lord and place them on ourselves, we very easily become Don Quixote tilting at windmills, supposing them to be giants out to get us. If the decline of Saul and the rise of David teach us anything, it is a warning to never take our eyes off of the Lord. Look at verse 2. And Jonathan told David, Saul, my father, seeks to kill you. Therefore, be on your guard in the morning, stay in a secret place and hide yourself. And I will go out and stand beside my father in the field where you are, and I will speak to my father about you. And if I learn anything, I will tell you. So Jonathan's first instinct when learning of his father's murderous plans was to run to David and let him know about all that Saul intended. So when he finds David, he drops that bomb without mincing any words. My father's going to kill you. This probably came as no surprise to David because Saul had twice previously tried to pin David to the wall with his spear in 1 Samuel 18:11. Jonathan warns him to be on the lookout for Saul's allies in the palace who would have been sent to kill him. He tells David, leave and hide out in a place in a field. There's no telling who all the king has commissioned as assassins. And Jonathan is not going to be idle. He has a plan in hopes of appealing to his father and attempting to learn of any other intentions against David that the king might have developed. Jonathan's plan really was quite bold and quite courageous. Saul was not in his right mind in much of what he was doing during this period of time. If Jonathan could be seen to be siding with David against anything that Saul was doing, Saul might very well turn on Jonathan, just as he turned against David. We know from 1 Samuel 14:6 that Jonathan has great faith in the Lord and the strength of his might. For he said in that passage, it may be that the Lord will work for us, for nothing can hinder the Lord from saving by many or by few. So while Saul had turned his back on any amount of faith and trust in the Lord, Jonathan had nothing but confidence in the Lord's faithfulness. Jonathan was undoubtedly trusting in the Lord's ability to protect him from even his own father when he approached the king on behalf of someone the king classified as an enemy of the state. Look at verse 4. And Jonathan spoke well of David to Saul, his father, and said to him, Let not the king sin against his servant David, because he has not sinned against you, and because his deeds have brought good to you. For he took his life in his hand and he struck down the Philistine, and the Lord worked a great salvation for all Israel. You saw it and rejoiced. Why then will you sin against innocent blood by killing David without cause? Jonathan's plan was to remind his father of how much David had done for him. Saul needed to be reminded that David was not really his enemy. David had only ever proven himself to be extremely loyal to King Saul and his efforts, even if those efforts intended to kill David. David had never complained about a hostile working environment or about constantly receiving the most dangerous of assignments. And Jonathan here, he's wise to make his appeal to the king on David's behalf when they were alone. He didn't speak back to the king in the middle of the other servants sent to kill David. That would have been humiliating to Saul and might have sparked an incredibly harsh response. He here reminds his father that David's exploits that were being celebrated throughout the kingdom had only served to help Saul. They were not an elaborate attempt, an elaborate plot to set himself up as better than King Saul. Rather, all of David's victories were in the name of the Lord on Saul's behalf as one of his servants, not one of his rivals. David risked death to accept Saul's request of who would go to fight against Goliath. Saul needed to be reminded that he was originally the one who asked if anyone would be willing to go out and fight against Goliath. And that action by David rescued the people and Saul himself from the hand of the Philistines. Jonathan goes on to remind Saul that he was originally joyful that David had gone out to fight against Goliath and was victorious. But then Jonathan takes everything a step further by accusing his father of openly sinning and by declaring David to be innocent of any of the imagined offenses that Saul had propped up as justification for execution. Now, if I had been Jonathan and had said all of these things, I might be now holding my breath for any potential expected explosions to come from Saul next. But something unbelievable and completely unexpected occurs. Verse 6. And Saul listened to the voice of Jonathan. Saul swore, As the Lord lives, he shall not be put to death. And Jonathan called David, and Jonathan reported to him all these things. And Jonathan brought David to Saul, and he was in his presence as before. Saul heard everything that Jonathan said to him, apparently without malice or paranoia or jealousy. Saul repents and completely turns in the opposite direction from where his actions had been taking him just a few verses previously. Saul removes the bounty that he had placed on David's head. Now, maybe Saul had to call all of those trusted servants back in from verse 1 of chapter 19 to tell them that David was no longer to be killed. We're not told how he undoes the original message, just that he does undo it. Here, Saul vows in the name of the Lord that he will not try to kill David any longer. Now, we know that this commitment will not last, but Saul's statement here is both profound to be coming from his mouth, but also very prophetic. Saul is essentially saying that the Lord would be just in any punishment against him if he were to violate his commitment to not try to execute David. And he is also prophesying that as long as the Lord is the living God, David will not be killed by another human hand. And this was true. Even though David would face many life-threatening battles, none of them would claim his life. And so, having heard his father's promise to remove the execution order on David, Jonathan yells out for David to come out of hiding. And David walks to Jonathan, and Jonathan seemingly casually just walks David right back into the palace as though nothing had happened before. Now, if I were David, I might be a little trepidatious here. I might want to wait for a little while for Saul to prove that he had really had a change of heart. I might be thinking that it would be wise just to wait a minute before waltzing right back to my old job, a personal musician. But David doesn't hesitate. He goes right back to the king's side, trusting in the Lord's protection. Verse 8. And there was war again, and David went out and fought with the Philistines and struck them with a great blow so that they fled before him. Then a harmful spirit from the Lord came upon Saul as he sat in his house with his spear in his hand, and David was playing the lyre. And Saul sought to pin David to the wall with the spear, but he eluded Saul, so that he struck the spear into the wall, and David fled and escaped that night. So Saul's commitment to David's survival turned out to be rather short-lived. See, the Philistines came back again, and that seems to be a nonstop theme with these people. So Saul did what he had to do. He sent out his greatest commander and his best warrior to push the enemies back. David fought with his men against the Philistines, striking them with a great blow. And this wording, it leads us to believe that this was not just a simple victory. This was a powerfully decisive victory against the Philistines in an apparently unique way, because this description has not been used up until this point. The Philistines are so overwhelmed with the battle skills of David and his men that they simply turn tail and run. The Philistines retreat in mass without a second look. David's undeniably powerful victory again places him at the forefront of everyone's mind as a source of excitement and celebration. And with the return of David to prominence also comes the afflicting spirit back into Saul's life. Jealousy fuels his paranoia, and his afflicted mind can only wander to the place of the conspiratorially ridiculous. He forgot all of the things that Jonathan had listed as reasons for David's loyalty, and Saul allowed his mind to be consumed with only all of the negative thoughts and feelings of assumptions that he had about David. So Saul was brooding with all of those negative thoughts swirling around in his brain while David was sitting nearby playing the lyre. And again, Saul was found to be holding his spear in his hand while his mind descended into darkness. Maybe Saul always had his spear in his hand, so it wasn't such an odd occurrence. But then again, the author goes out of his way to comment on it here. Either way, Saul again talks himself into what he believes to be his only possible recourse. He dives towards David and ends up driving the spear deep into the wall. But this time is different than the last time. This time, David doesn't allow Saul a second attempt. When the spear sticks into the wall, David quickly ducked out and fled into the night. This would be the last time that David would be in Saul's presence in this way. From now until the end of Saul's life, David would be on the run from the king. Verse 11. Saul sent messengers to David's house to watch him, that he might kill him in the morning. But Michal, David's wife, told him, "If you do not escape with your life tonight, tomorrow you will be killed." So Michal let David down through the window, and he fled away and escaped. Michal took an image and laid it on the bed and put a pillow of goat's hair at its head and covered it with the clothes. As soon as David escaped from Saul's grasp in the palace, Saul commissions some of his servants to go and stake out David's house in the city. Saul wants to know if David goes anywhere during the night because he intends to have him executed in the morning. Somehow Saul's daughter and David's wife, Michal, discover Saul's plot to kill him. So just as when Jonathan learns of Saul's desire to kill David, one of Saul's own children works to rescue David from his hand. Michal reveals her loyalty towards David trumps that of her loyalty to her father. She helps David escape from her father's attempt to kill him in the morning. Now, the passage doesn't say why they didn't just barge into the house that night, the messengers, why they waited outside. Maybe there was some kind of decorum that was a violation if the house of the king's daughter was hostilely entered without invitation. For whatever reason, the messengers simply remain outside watching to see if David leaves at some point during the night. And now, maybe Michal recognized the messengers from among her father's servants as guys who specifically did this kind of work. So she helps David secretly slip out of the window outside of the watchful eye of the messengers, and she takes an image, which is the Hebrew word for household god, as it is translated in Genesis 31:19, when Rachel stole Laban's household gods. Interestingly enough, both of those instances involve deception and a wife trying to protect her husband from her own father. And this actually reveals a great deal about Michal and her own personal faith beyond even the presence of an idol in her home. David had no knowledge of Michal and how much trust she was placing in the deception of the idol. Now, David wrote in Psalm 59, David wrote Psalm 59 in his house while the men were waiting outside. And Psalm 59 is a prayer confessing total dependence on God for salvation. All the while, Michal trusted her household idol, David trusted the Lord. Verse 14. And when Saul sent messengers to take David, she said, "He is sick." Then Saul sent the messengers to see David, saying, "Bring him up to me in the bed that I may kill him." And when the messengers came in, behold, the image was in the bed and the pillow of goat's hair at its head. When the morning arrives, Saul's messengers receive word from Saul to go and take David. But Michal intercepts them by saying that they cannot see David because he's not feeling well. The messengers may have been confused. They had a job from the king, but now the princess was telling them they couldn't do that job right now. So they report to Saul what his daughter had said, and Saul sends them back to her house. And all this back and forth, it's buying David even more time while he's fleeing from town. Saul gives the messengers no wiggle room in their assignment. They are not to return to him without David in their possession, even if they have to rip him from the bed, vomit flying everywhere. If Saul's going to kill him anyway, it doesn't matter if he's not feeling well because he won't be feeling anything if Saul gets his way. So they come in to grab David only to discover that it wasn't really him in the bed, but rather just a diversion. So the messengers return to Saul without David, but they do bring Michal with them. They are probably confused as to Saul's intentions and mood concerning his daughter, and worried and anxious. Maybe Saul would be upset with her for helping David, but maybe he will be upset with them for manhandling his daughter. So they probably err on the side of both. They bring her in, but they probably deal very delicately with her, just in case. Verse 17. Saul said to Michal, "Why have you deceived me thus, and let my enemy go so that he has escaped?" And Michal answered Saul, he said to me, "Let me go. Why should I kill you?" Now Saul's really earned assumption was that Michal had betrayed him in order to help her traitorous husband escape with his life. And Saul would seem to see this as all but an open rebellion and play for the throne by his named enemy and his own daughter. Saul was absolutely correct in assuming Michal had helped David escape, but she has devised a lie to save her own life and to help her father save face before the people. Michal says that she only helped David to escape because he had threatened her life if she didn't help. This would have made perfect sense to Saul because it seems to have been the very same type of thing that he would have done. He was not above threatening and killing whomever to get what he wanted. So naturally, he would have assumed David would have done the very same thing. But Saul doesn't understand someone with the character of David. David would not have threatened to kill Michal for the same reason that he later refuses to kill Saul when given the opportunity twice. David would rather live honorably for the Lord than make dishonorably sinful decisions that are ultimately selfish. Saul, hearing Michal's confession, he doesn't think too deeply about how plausible it really is, because if he had really thought about it, the natural follow-up question he should have asked would have been, if you really were loyal to me, why did you not immediately go out and alert the messengers outside the moment that David was out the window? Saul didn't dig too deep. Maybe he really didn't think that he could, maybe he really did think he could trust Michal, or maybe he really knew what was going on and he didn't want his daughter to face the consequences for helping the enemy. Whatever the reason, Saul accepted Michal's explanation and David made it safely away. Look at verse 18. Now, David fled and escaped, and he came to Samuel at Ramah and told him all that Saul had done to him. And he and Samuel went and lived at Naioth. Now remember, for the moment, that Saul's palace is not located in Jerusalem. Jerusalem didn't belong to Israel yet. The Jebusites lived there. The very first thing that David does when he is confirmed as king is to go and take Jerusalem. So Saul's capital city here is Gibeah of Benjamin, which is about 4 or so miles north of Jerusalem. And then when David flees Gibeah, he doesn't return to his original home in Bethlehem. Instead, David chooses to run to Samuel, the prophet. Samuel had started this whole thing by listening to the Lord and anointing David as the next king. And now Ramah was Samuel's hometown. It was where his parents had been from and where he had returned when he became the prophet, when he became the last judge of Israel. Now, what's crazy about Ramah is it's only 3 miles away from Gibeah. So David didn't go very far from Saul's headquarters. He gave Samuel then a full report of how crazy Saul had gone, which was probably not that much of a surprise to Samuel. Besides being a prophet, Samuel had seen firsthand Saul's delusions. Then David and Samuel head to a place called Naioth. Now, the next verse after this says that Naioth is actually in Ramah, which could mean that it's within the city limits or that it is in the region around Ramah, more likely. And this could also be the place of worship for prophets near Ramah that is mentioned back in 1 Samuel 9:22, where Samuel took Saul before he anointed him. And this description would actually fit well with the description of the activities that are about to take place with the great company of prophets present that we'll explore next week. So thank you for joining us as we go verse by verse through the entire Old Testament. I hope you'll come back next week as we explore what happens in this instance when Saul discovers that David didn't run to a foreign nation or run to the far reaches of the country, that he just ran really to Saul's backyard over a few miles away in Ramah.